I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. I'm the Chief Science Officer here at Big Bold Health. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, brain health, and specifically brain longevity. And we're going to focus on the role of diet and the immune system in influencing brain longevity. So, this is a powerful topic. As you'll see, it has relevance to all of us. There's some really compelling new science that's just been published that we're going to get into. And I think that this is the type of stuff that is the news to use, as Dr. Bland often says, because this is the type of information that really can make a difference in terms of the quality and the quantity of our years. Okay, quick disclaimer here. This is for educational purposes only. I'm not your physician. I'm not making recommendations for your care. So don't use this information as a substitute for seeking medical care if needed. And in terms of what we're going to be covering today, so we'll get into the science of brain longevity. Why does it matter so much in terms of what actually influences health? We'll focus on some of the key systems within the brain that are linked to brain longevity. We'll talk about, in particular, the immune system. So there are many systems that influence brain longevity, but we're going to narrow in on the immune system, and we'll explore how diet impacts the immune system in particular as it relates to longevity. Then we'll talk some about additional lifestyle variables because it's not all about food, movement, sleep, and other things matter. And we'll talk about what the research tells us in terms of if we're looking at lifestyle for brain longevity, what are the most kind of science-backed tools that we should be considering each day if our goal is, and it really should be, to protect our brain health long term. So, why should you care about brain longevity? I mean, I guess you don't have to share, but there's different ages of people who are listening to this, whether you're listening live or after the fact. There's a spectrum of people who are interested in brain health and for different reasons. Some of you are older already. You're in your 70s, you're in your 80s, and you're worried about your brain long term. Some of you are younger, you're in your middle age, and maybe you've started to experience some signs of cognitive issues. And some of you may be even younger, maybe in your 20s, 30s, and you're just passionate about science. Or you may have had friends, family members, others who have experienced brain issues like Alzheimer's disease. So there are so many reasons to get into this conversation, but the bottom line is that brain longevity matters to all of us, both in terms of the people we care about and for ourselves. There is a important trend happening globally right now, which is that people are on average going to be living longer, which is great, but it also means that as it relates to where people are born and how old people are, that the age average for the total of the United States and around the world is going up, meaning that 1 in 6 people globally will be over age 65 in the next couple of decades by 2050. Right now, it's only 1 in 10. When we look at the number of people aged 80 or higher, it's going to triple to 100 or 459 million by 2050. And in the United States, adults age 65 or older will outnumber children under 18 by the year 2034. So we're seeing this massive transition in terms of the average age of the population. Again, it's a good thing. People are living longer, but simultaneously, we need to be aware that certain things tend to happen as our brains get older. This brings us to the first of the major concerns around brain longevity, which is cognitive decline. Right now, there are about 57 million people worldwide who have dementia. And a recent study just came out showing that if we live to over the age of 55, our lifetime risk of having dementia is now 42% in the United States. This is compelling recent research. Alzheimer's is the seventh leading cause of death in the United States. It's the sixth leading cause of death if we live to over the age of 65. And our risk for developing Alzheimer's, if we live to age 65, which hopefully we all do, is 1 in 14. But if you live to age 80, it's then 1 in 6. So these are not trivial issues. These are things that influence us all. I hope all of you live to a very long lifespan, potentially 100 or longer. And if you want to live that long, then you need to be thinking not just about being alive, but being cognitively intact. So how are we talking about brain longevity? There's no actual technical term for what this means. So I'm going to be explaining this in terms of having a brain that works its best to promote clear thinking, life satisfaction, and connection to something bigger than yourself, the people around you, nature, something that matters across the longest life possible, so the most years possible. This isn't just about the number of years, it's the quality of the years, and it's about having a quality brain that accompanies you across your years of your life. When we think about brain longevity science, I would say the goal is to preserve cognitive function, structural integrity, and emotional regulation into old age. These are the things that really define a well-functioning brain. We want a brain that thinks well, that enables us to emotionally regulate ourselves, and also that actually physically and functionally performs at a high level. The pathways that are at play here, and we'll get into some science. I know that some of you are really into hearing all the neuroscience, and some of you just want to jump to, well, what do I do about it? But we are going to talk a bit about some of the underlying science. And what the research suggests is that if you want to have a brain that not only lasts you until the end of your life, but lasts at a really high level, then you need to be thinking about pathways like neuroplasticity, thinking about metabolic efficiency. You need to be thinking about generally protecting your neurons. We'll get into a couple of these pathways in detail as it relates to the immune system. The first of the key understandings in terms of how the brain changes over the lifespan, beyond just saying, that we have a higher risk of developing dementia, is to know that our brain shrinks over time. This is called atrophy. Sometimes people describe this atrophy as a removal of neurons. Now, you have on average roughly half of the cells in your brain neurons, roughly 80 billion cells. But what research has revealed is it's not actually a loss in the neurons. It's not as though we lose that much of our brain mass in terms of neurons. What more seems to be the case is that we have an atrophy of the synapses. We have less connections. We have less kind of functional connectivity between our neurons. In any case, our actual brain volume, the mass of brain in your skull, decreases at about 5% per decade after the age of 40, and the rate of this decrease increases after the age of 70, at which point you see a very rapid decline in the total mass of your brain. That's a really compelling statistic because historically, and I'm curious about all of you and let me know, it has felt like it's the case that we don't worry about our brain health until we get to be older adults, at which point we say, oh, well, I'm having a senior moment, or mom or dad or a relative is having more trouble with memory, but they don't remember where the keys are. But people don't appreciate the reality that starting at the age of, some research even says mid 30s, we start to lose brain mass at a very dramatic rate with each passing decade. This isn't necessarily to say that this is explicitly a bad thing, because we know that our brains will functionally change and structurally change over our lifespans. Some of that is good. So removal of certain synapses when we're children is actually a good thing because it helps us to solidify the brain networks necessary for us to function at a high level. But generally speaking, I would say we don't want to experience major amounts of atrophy as we age because that atrophy is associated with worse cognition. A healthy lifestyle, which is including the making of healthy changes right now and later in life, can help to prevent brain atrophy. That's really important. There are things you can do right now and later in life that can fight back against the loss of brain tissue. And what we're going to be focused on today primarily is how to leverage lifestyle as a way to help target multiple aspects of brain aging. The key pathways that we'll talk about today are going to be the reduction of chronic inflammation, the enhancement of neuroplasticity, which is the rewiring of the brain, support for mitochondrial and metabolic function, and then maintenance of the blood-brain barrier. Now, to just go through these very briefly, we'll talk about brain inflammation in a very deep level. But neuroplasticity is the rewiring of the brain. It's the idea that every moment of every day, we're changing the strength and number of the connections between our neurons. And this tends to be incredibly important, not just for cognition, but also for basic mental function and for mental health. Mitochondrial and metabolic function obviously is getting a lot of play right now. You've probably seen a whole lot of people talking about the role of metabolism across the spectrum of different issues. And it is absolutely the case that brain metabolism is key to brain health. And then finally, blood-brain barrier function. Your brain is surrounded by a thin barrier called the blood-brain barrier, and it's actually made up of a couple of small layers. And what's important about this is that you need to have an intact and strong blood-brain barrier, just like you need a strong and intact gut membrane or gut barrier in order to make sure that what gets into the brain is what you want in the brain, and things that you don't want getting into the brain don't get into the brain. So, When it comes to the role of diet, which will be the cornerstone as we talk about various ways to potentially intervene on this, we know that diet and immunity majorly influence brain aging. So the diet influences the immune system influences the brain. Chronic inflammatory and immune imbalances are really becoming central to our understanding of what can go wrong with brain health. And diet is, as I'm sure many of you already know, one of the most powerful things that we can leverage in order to shape our immune system, and in doing so, to help to boost brain resilience. Finally, nutrients within our diet can actually change brain cells, specifically brain immune cells. Why that's important is because our brain's immune cells, as we'll talk about in just a moment, are key to longevity. In addition, the food that we eat, the nutrients that we consume, influence brain metabolism, which therefore shapes the way that our brain is able to respond to environment. One quick point I'll make here is as we age, research shows that our brains are less able to kind of use standard metabolic pathways. What you see is the brain seems to be less capable of extracting glucose and utilizing glucose. Why that matters is not only does it predispose people to dementia, where you can say, based on a person's metabolic brain decline, you can predict people who will get dementia, but you can actually see that as we age, we tend to lose that metabolic function in the brain. So a lot of therapeutics now are focused on trying to find ways to improve brain metabolism. And a study that actually just came out a couple of days ago looked at, for example, creatine monohydrate in people with dementia to improve cognition. The reason being, it is believed that creatine may help to boost brain metabolic function. So there's lots we'll talk about in a little bit as it relates to certain dietary patterns around keto and other diets that may enhance brain metabolism. But key to understand here is that the food that we eat plays upon all of these different pathways within the brain, especially immunity, which influence brain longevity. So let's get to the path that we're going to spend the most time on today, which is neuroinflammation. If you've heard me speak before, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, not only because it's so interesting, but because of how important it is to understand the role of inflammation on brain health. So what is neuroinflammation? There are a couple of variables here. Different people define this differently. I've kind of come to the understanding that the key to the comprehension of what neuroinflammation represents is an activation of certain cells in your brain called microglial cells. And let me know in the comments if you like. Have you ever heard of a microglial cell before? Either because you've heard me talk about it or somebody else has mentioned it. I'm always curious about whether this is something that people have heard about or it's new to them. But neuroinflammation, you see activation of these microglial cells. You see an elevation in molecules called cytokines. These are immune proteins. And you see oxidative stress. Neuroinflammation is thought to be central to our understanding of neurodegeneration, how the brain declines over time, as well as mood issues and behavioral changes. And as we're looking at what seems to be most correlated with neuroinflammation, what you see is an elevation in inflammatory molecules like interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, as well as in the body, CRP, which is C-reactive peptide or protein. These are believed to increase risk for developing brain inflammation. Microglial cell inflammation, or specifically activation, seems to be key. You have these cells within the brain, they're microglial cells. They make up between 10 to 15% of the cells in your brain. Your brain has around 160 billion cells, which means you have roughly 20 billion microglial cells in your brain. When they become activated for one reason or another, they can actually dramatically influence your brain's immune state. And these, again, seem to be key to the understanding of what is linked to neuroinflammation and subsequently to brain longevity. Finally, brain inflammation or neuroinflammation, we now understand to be dramatically influenced by what we do in our lives. Our lifestyle changes our degree of neuroinflammation. Okay, there's a related term here. Again, let me know if you've heard this one before, because I know we're getting a little bit technical with the science, but it's called inflammaging. Inflammaging. So let me know in the comments, have you ever heard of the term inflammaging before? If you have, sounds like you're doing some scientific research or you're listening to other people talk about these topics. I'm seeing a lot of yeses in the comments in this live. If you're watching this after the fact, let us know in the comments. I'd be super curious. So inflammaging is a chronic low-grade inflammation that accelerates aging. Let me say that again. When we think about what is driving aging, not only in the body, but within the brain, Inflammation, not a huge level of inflammation, but a chronic low-grade inflammation seems to be a key to that system. And inflammaging is the understanding, it's the term used for this connection between low-grade inflammation and more rapid aging. Really interesting stuff. There are a number of markers that are correlated with inflammaging. Again, some of those that I just described. But what is important for the brain is that inflammaging seems to drive damage to neurons, loss of synapses, which is again key to brain atrophy, and then just generally atrophy. We know that inflammaging is also linked to a number of other issues, and nutrition, exercise, and gut health all seem to be linked to countering inflammaging. Now, as we think about the immune metabolic link, here's another whole domain of research, immunometabolism, the link between the immune system and our metabolic system. What do we know here? First of all, our immune systems have to eat. Our immune cells have to eat. So we know that the food that we eat programs our immune system. High inflammation or immune activation can actually deplete our body's energetic reserves because we basically wind up using all of our energy in the immune system. And that means less potential energy for the brain. Mitochondrial dysfunction. You've heard of mitochondria. They're usually called the powerhouses of the cell. Interestingly, you can have thousands of mitochondria in a single neuron. So the brain is incredibly dependent on mitochondrial health to function well. Mitochondrial dysfunction links to both immune dysfunction and cognitive decline. And mitochondria are the central metabolic centers for our cells. We know that certain nutrients, I mentioned creatine, but also omega-3s, polyphenols, other dietary nutrients, influence our immune system and our metabolism, and therefore both of these seem to have a prominent role in supporting the brain. And what we're seeing now is research on immunometabolism as a brain longevity target. There are a number of recent publications looking at certain pharmaceuticals and other molecules as it relates to how they influence immunometabolism and the potential that they may provide in terms of promoting better brain health. We also need to cover, as always, this connection between the gut and the brain, but we're going to expand that a little bit to the gut-brain immune axis. So you may know that roughly 70% of the immune system is located in the gut. I think that number is actually a little lower now. Some research just came out showing that more of the immune system is in the blood, but bottom line, a huge percentage of the immune system is located in and around the gut. Microbes in the gut, as part of the gut microbiome, produce molecules that directly impact the brain. So short chain fatty acids, which are kind of the byproducts of the microbes in our gut, eating things like fiber, are known to influence brain metabolism and brain immunity. We also know that neurotransmitter precursors, which we'll talk about in a moment, come from our diet. Dysbiosis, which is alterations in our gut microbiome towards a imbalance in healthy versus unhealthy microbes, is linked to cognitive issues, mood issues. So we know there's something related to the microbes in our gut that changes the way our brain functions. How does this happen? Well, it may be in large part through the immune system. And then we know that the dietary components like polyphenols and fiber and fermented foods can benefit brain health. Why is that the case? It's because in part they work through the gut, which then translates into the immune system, that then translates into better brain health. And then one thing I'll just bring up here, so I've been talking about this a lot, is the connection between something like brain fog, which turns out to be incredibly common, and what happens in our gut. So a lot of people experience brain fog, this feeling of, oh, I'm just not quite on. It's not like you have a diagnosis. It's not like you have a disease, but your thinking just isn't quite right. And now our understanding is that the immune system plays a major role in brain fog. How does that get programmed? Well, one of the big variables that influences the immune system, as I mentioned, is what happens in our gut. So how do we leverage diet? How do we use diet as a brain longevity tool? Our brains are made from our food. This seems so obvious, and yet so many people miss this. When we talk about what happens in our bodies as a reflection of our diet, many people are focused on, I'm just going to boost my immune system with vitamin C, and that's going to improve my brain health for some reason or another. But think about the fact that your brain is actually made of what you eat. We're going to talk about this in a moment, and it's so profound to understand just how unique your brain is and how much food plays a role. We'll also talk about these other pathways related to neurotransmitters and how food influences our brains otherwise. So brain building, what is your brain made of? Your brain is mostly made of fat. Fascinating little bit of trivia here. It's about 60% fat if you took out the water weight. And about 35% of the fat in your brain is what are called omega-3 fatty acids or omega-3 fats. You probably heard of these before. When you break that down further, what you see is that about 40% of your brain omega-3s are DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. That's really interesting because you're not really able to synthesize a lot of DHA naturally from your precursor molecules. You have to consume either the precursor to DHA, which is called EPA, or consume DHA in your diet in order to get adequate levels of this molecule. Let's talk a little bit about this other piece, which is our food turns into our neurotransmitters. That's really interesting because neurotransmitters, as you probably heard from famous podcasters or other people, are obviously quite influential in terms of our cognition, in terms of our mood. So there are neurotransmitters like dopamine that we know is involved in motivation and pleasure seeking. There are neurotransmitters like GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, that kind of calms down our brain function. There are other ones like serotonin, you probably heard about, implicated in mood. And the important thing to understand is that you have to build these neurotransmitters out of something. Where do these neurotransmitters come from? Well, initially they come from the building blocks that come from our diet. Now, I'm going to just give you a couple of little caveats here because certain neurotransmitters directly come from precursors from our diet. That's because the amino acids, these are kind of the protein building blocks from which neurotransmitters are built, are essential, meaning we cannot make them ourselves. They have to come from our diet. And a good example here would be tryptophan. Many of you have probably heard about tryptophan. I know I first heard about it in the context of saying, well, if you eat a lot of turkey after Thanksgiving meal, you're going to be sleepy because tryptophan is, it causes people to become sleepy. The reality is that the actual pathway behind this is so much more complicated and interesting. So tryptophan, which we consume in our diet, can be converted into serotonin. We can't make tryptophan. So serotonin production is tethered to tryptophan. However, here's a little bit of a caveat to this. Some people will say, well, the majority of the serotonin is made in your gut, and therefore the gut is the most important thing for your mood. Two things. One is the serotonin produced in your gut does not cross the blood-brain barrier. So the serotonin your gut makes, your microbiome makes, is not the same serotonin in your brain that influences mood. The other thing is we now understand that serotonin is not the primary reason why a person does or does not experience good mood. It's part of the conversation, but it's certainly not the only piece. All that is to say, to go take this a couple steps back, neurotransmitters come from our diet, at least they're precursors. And while they're not necessarily all essential, meaning our bodies can make them themselves, our bodies have to make them out of something. So just real quick here, tyrosine, which is another amino acid, even though it's not an essential amino acid, gets converted into dopamine. Dopamine, again, you've probably heard of in the context of motivation. You may have read The Molecule of More or other books on this topic. Dopamine gets converted into norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, as you probably know, is a key molecule involved in kind of being awake, being activated, sympathetic nervous system stimulation. And so all of these things are to say that every bite of food that we take has all of these different roles to play in terms of how our brains get programmed. Now we're going to focus on this really key cornerstone understanding. And this is where Big Bold Health has focused a lot of its effort and where our recent publication on Himalayan tartary buckwheat focused a lot of its effort, which is how our food influences our immunity. And in this conversation, we're going to be focused on brain immunity in particular. So at this point, if I was to ask you if you've heard of microglial cells, everyone should say yes, unless you just joined. But again, remember that your brain has roughly 20% of its cells made up of what are called microglial cells. And microglial cells are so interesting because they're basically allowing our brains to detect and interact with the outside world. I should rephrase that. 20% of your brain's glial cells, which means your brain's accessory cells, which still gives us about 20 billion cells. So the brain's immune system is made up of these microglial cells. That means 10% of our brain's total cells, 20% of our brain's glial cells, which are half of our brain cells. And they influence things like memory, neuroplasticity, cell cleanup, brain aging, mood, cognition, and so much more. So the brain has an immune system. And our neurons, which many people know are our principal brain cells, interact with other brain cells in order to produce an immune response within the brain. We also know that the blood-brain barrier, that protective coat around our brain, is involved in the immune system because it gets to determine many of the molecules that are either allowed to or are not allowed to reach into our brain and influence how our brains function. How our brain system, immune system functions is now known to influence how we think, how we act, and how we feel. And this is powerful stuff. I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding around how emotions exist or how we think or why we have the behaviors that we do. I think a lot of this kind of relies on these constructs like willpower or a person's mind or a person's identity. We'd say, well, that's just how that person is. But if you were to drill down and say, well, why is that person the way they are? And why is it that any of us change the way that we think, act, and feel on a given day? It turns out your brain's immune system is key to that understanding. Okay, so now let's bring back this topic of longevity and connect that to brain immunity. Aging of your brain's cells is a concept called senescence. So aging of your brain cells drives aging in the brain. They're not exactly the same thing. What I mean to say is an older brain could be kind of measured through a number of different metrics. But if you were to look at the cells within your brain and see that certain cells had aged more rapidly than anticipated, that actually could promote more rapid aging of your brain. So you can get into a feed forward cycle. Aging of the brain and the body's immune cells, a term we called immunosenescence, seems to be exceptionally important for aging of the brain. The brain seems to be exceptionally sensitive to immune activation. And that means that targeting brain aging through the immune system is emerging as a key way to influence brain aging. I'm going to focus on this just for another moment. Brain aging doesn't necessarily happen at the same rate as body aging. You can have what is called organ specific aging, meaning your liver may be older than your heart. That doesn't mean that the number of years they've both been alive is different, but if you looked at the cells and how much the cells have kind of been changed and experienced aging over the years of your life, that your liver maybe has a different experience than your heart. And the same is true for the brain. Our goal is to have a more youthful brain by making sure that we try to mitigate some of these more rapid aging pathways within the brain. So if we want to target brain aging, specifically we want to target brain aging through the immune system, we want to look at these microglial cells. What are the things that influence microglial cell health? These are all the things that you're aware of in terms of lifestyle variables that influence our overall state of wellness. What do we know about diet in particular? Well, certain aspects of our diet seem to preferentially increase aging of the brain, and in particular, they seem to activate the brain's immune system to be not so helpful. So what kind of diet would we want to avoid? This is the Western diet, the American diet, the standard American diet, an ultra-processed diet. This is a diet that's high in added sugars, high in refined carbohydrates, contains things like trans fats, which are basically humans messing with fats in order to make them a bit more useful in the kitchen, but actually turned out to have a negative effect on our health, and just more generally, ultra-processed food. What we can see in terms of what that does to our immune system is that it increases these inflammatory pathways. Now, conversely, if we weren't going to be eating the ultra-processed diet, what is a diet that has been shown to have a beneficial effect? We'll talk about some of that research in just a moment, but generally speaking, what we know is that a Mediterranean pattern diet, and I'm certain there will be comments about, well, actually people in the Mediterranean don't eat what we now describe as a Mediterranean pattern diet. That's fine. What we're talking about here are the components of what we would label a Mediterranean pattern diet, which is minimally processed foods, healthy fats, lots of plants, rich in polyphenols, rich in fiber, omega-3s. These are the types of foods that have been associated with the exact opposite in terms of benefiting brain health, in terms of benefiting longevity in the body and in the brain. Some of the foods that have been associated with longevity include berries, leafy greens, fatty fish, and olive oil. And so for those who are interested, there's lots of studies around this, but there's some specific studies for those types of foods. And what we know about all this is that diet seems to influence the immune system in the body and in the brain. What are the best studied diets? If you said you were going to choose a diet based solely on what was most brain protective, what would the data say? The best studied diets for brain health in most people are the Mediterranean pattern diet first. That's number one. Then the Mediterranean dash intervention for neurodevelopmental or neurodegenerative delay, which is the MIND diet, MIND. We'll talk about this next one though in a moment, which is keto, right? So where do you put something like the ketogenic diet in this conversation? To start with, what do we know about brain aging in particular with a variant of the Mediterranean pattern diet? A series of studies have been conducted in the last 5 years looking at a diet called the Green Med diet. And so this is basically a Mediterranean pattern diet that is supplemented with additional polyphenols. Polyphenols are nutrients naturally found in plants that have been shown to influence the immune system, that have been shown to influence longevity pathways. So researchers in this multinational study have been looking at the effect of how a Mediterranean diet plus a Mediterranean diet that is supplemented with polyphenols influences markers of aging. And one of the studies that they did, a subset of this study, was to look at how this diet influenced brain-related brain atrophy, again, the shrinkage of the brain. They had people consuming a Mediterranean pattern diet or a Mediterranean plus diet with these polyphenols for 18 months. And not only did they find that people generally benefited, meaning rate of atrophy declined in people consuming a Mediterranean pattern diet, but that there were improvements beyond that in people who were consuming extra polyphenols. And so they said here that the key seems to be that the polyphenols, this big family of plant nutrients found in naturally colorful plants, vegetables, minimally processed plant-based foods, may be carrying some of this longevity signal specifically for the brain. So, Mediterranean diet seems to be the best studied diet as of now for protecting the brain long term and for helping the brain to promote general longevity so that you think clearly and keep your brain stable over time. But what about some of these other diets that we've heard about? Caloric restriction and fasting. These are very trendy diets. I feel like fasting has slightly fallen out of fashion in the last kind of couple of years. It's been kind of in vogue for some time, but these are diets that are interesting because in animal data, when you calorically restrict, let's say, a mouse, the mouse lives longer. So fasting is kind of a variant on total caloric restriction, or I should say caloric restriction is a variant on fasting. But what do we know about how this relates to humans? So, as stated, caloric restriction means just eating less calories. And this isn't just for a day or two, it just means that over time, you kind of slightly starve these animals, that these animals tend to live longer and their brain health tends to be better. We also know that intermittent fasting, which is a form of fasting where you might go a couple of days fasting and then go back to a normal diet. There's also time restricted eating, which is similar, that it seems to promote immune system health, metabolic health to some extent. There's also some preclinical data, which means it has not been done in humans necessarily, but has been shown in animals that caloric restriction and intermittent fasting can promote autophagy. Autophagy is kind of the cleanup function within our cells. But importantly here, when we're looking at these restrictive diets, either calorically restrictive or as we'll talk about here in a moment with the keto diet, which is a restrictive diet in terms of macronutrients, that these things may actually create some stress on the brain and the body long term. We may want some of that stress short term, but long term, we're not as clear as to whether that is valuable. And I would say at this point in time, if we're looking for long-term brain health, we don't really have any good long-term data suggesting that caloric restriction, intermittent fasting forms of diet are beneficial to long-term brain health. Certainly, we have better data for a Mediterranean pattern diet. That's important because one of the keys to understanding how to promote your brain health, not just today, but for decades to come, and one of my core messages is looking at sustainability in everything that we do. There is a lot of focus right now on saying, well, just do this one thing one time and don't worry about everything else and it'll solve itself. Because if you just do this one thing, it fixes everything. The reality is that the data are quite consistent. The people who do the best are the people who make simple steps sustainable over time. So that's kind of my concern with what caloric fasting or restriction represents. But let's talk about the ketogenic diet. Now, I'll do this one more time and then I'll stop. But let me know in the comments who here has heard about the ketogenic diet. And if you've heard about the ketogenic diet, aka keto, what have you heard? What has been the information that you've heard as to the potential value and also potential downsides? Okay, some of the people who are here live are saying they have not heard of it. Some are saying they have heard of it. The ketogenic diet or the keto diet is basically one in which you restrict your carbohydrates. That's kind of the key to it. So you limit your total carb intake to around 20 to 50 grams per day. Many of you may have actually tried the keto diet. It's quite popular. What it does is it promotes something called ketosis, which is measurable levels of ketone bodies in your bloodstream, actually elevated over what they would typically be. The ketogenic diet increases three ketone bodies. They're technically not all ketones, but they are ketone bodies: beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone. And what's interesting about this is first, the liver produces most ketone bodies, but the brain can also produce some ketones as well. And after 3 days of fasting, we will use about 25% of ketones for our brain energy. There is data showing that our brain's cells preferentially will use ketones over glucose. And the idea here, which makes this so fascinating, is that, as I alluded to earlier, the brain seems like it may become less able, less metabolically flexible, but less able to extract and use glucose as time goes on. Glucose, blood sugar, is the primary fuel for the brain, but it seems like as we get older and as we develop issues with our brain function, it becomes harder and harder for our brains to get access to fuel. And so some researchers, including Suzanne Delamont, who I've actually interviewed before, have proposed that this metabolic dysfunction within the brain is driving a whole lot of brain issues. So if we can bypass the glucose needs by supplying our brain cells with ketones, there is this potential opportunity to improve cognition, which I find very interesting. Some people swear by keto. They say it's the best thing ever. What do we know about keto, though, as it relates to the topic of this lecture, which is brain longevity? Not much. We don't have data from decades of people using these types of diets because they really haven't been popular for that long. We also don't know from a sustainability level whether it's a good idea to cut out fiber. You don't have to cut out fiber with keto, but usually when people go keto, they tend to dramatically decrease fiber intake. And we know that fiber intake correlates with longer lifespan and correlates with better gut health, which we know correlates with better brain health. In addition, a keto diet tends to be one that depletes numbers of things like polyphenols, which, as we've discussed, are actually associated with longevity. So what I would say about the ketogenic diet right now is that mechanistically, it shows promise specifically in helping people who have metabolic dysfunction, which turns out these days to be most people, but we don't know yet about the sustainability for long-term brain health. So if we have time at the end, I'll take some questions. So I'm sure people may have a couple questions on that, but I think there's still some real great opportunity with testing this in large-scale studies. But right now, I think the Mediterranean diet is still far more studied in terms of long-term brain health. Okay, in terms of individual nutrients, what do we know? So omega-3s, EPA and DHA in particular, are known to balance the immune system. They work on membrane fluidity. We kind of use a ton of these omega-3s in our neuronal membranes, which is a good thing, but most people are not getting enough omega-3s in their diet. Polyphenols. So polyphenols are used by our gut microbes. They also influence the immune system, and they may be one of the keys to longevity-focused diets. In addition, magnesium, B vitamins, or sorry, fiber is something that we need to be considering. As I mentioned before, fiber is something that correlates with overall longevity. We also know that most people are not consuming enough fiber. They're actually consuming about half of what they need. And then additional nutrients, magnesium, B vitamins, choline, these are essential for neuroplasticity, for cognition. These are brain-focused nutrients that we may not be getting enough of through our food. So for those interested, here's just a couple of studies that have been recently published looking at certain dietary nutrients as it relates to cognitive function. So you can feel free to go back and check into these if that's interesting to you to actually read the hard science. But point here being is that we are getting more and more insight into specific nutrients and how they may influence brain longevity. One other point on this topic before we move on to the non-food interventions for brain longevity is that there is a difference between supplement and whole foods, meaning eating a whole food gives you access to thousands of nutrients, many of which we don't even know about, that are found in a real food. We also know that different combinations of food can influence how our bodies leverage that food. So, for example, if you've ever used a continuous glucose monitor, which maybe some of you have, I've done this multiple times, you will see that if you were to consume something with a high glycemic index, meaning something that is a simple carbohydrate by itself, that your blood sugar will spike quite quickly. But if you were to eat that same carbohydrate along with some fat, some protein, what you would see is that your glycemic excursion, meaning your blood sugar, doesn't raise as high because we know that combination of fat, protein, and carbohydrate has a different effect on blood sugar than just eating, let's say, some refined carbohydrate by itself. So we know that the way that we're able to absorb nutrients, the way that our bodies handle nutrients, is going to be influenced by food combinations. We also know that diet pattern matters more than any individual food, meaning it's overall what you choose to consume across your lifespan that matters more than, oh, well, I had some superfood one day and then I went back to my normal dietary patterns the next day. General considerations here. Try to optimize towards diversity of food, color of food. If you can eat seasonally, great. Not all of us can. Many of us wind up going to big box grocery stores, and if you do, buying frozen food can actually be an amazing option to preserve some of the nutrients from when those plants were picked or those vegetables and fruits were picked at their highest potency. But the key to all of this is to try to eat less processed foods. It's quite basic. I know there's a lot of nuance to it and saying, oh, well, what constitutes an ultra processed food? Is this something that is or isn't good for me? It has a couple of ingredients. Honestly, the less ingredients, the better. It doesn't mean that it's going to universally apply. If you're going to eat a bag of refined sugar, it doesn't have that many ingredients, but it doesn't make it good for you. But generally speaking, the less ingredients, the better. Whole foods are better than processed foods. Okay. So if we have some time at the end, I will come back and take some questions around food. I know there's going to be some questions more about keto and what that might represent. You can always drop those in the comments as well, and we'll try to get to them later. But I do want to talk about a couple of other variables that relate to brain longevity. So let's talk a little bit about stress, sleep, the brain, and how it influences the immune system within the brain. Chronic stress, which I feel like these days is just normal life, uh, is a problem. We all kind of know this. There's the feeling we get when we're constantly anxious and activated. And a lot of us, myself included, feel it in our gut. Why is that the case? Well, one of the reasons is because when we produce stress hormones, in particular cortisol, it actually seems to act on and influence our gut. And in particular, it seems that cortisol may actually make our gut more permeable, more leaky, which we don't really want long term. Point here is to say, though, because stress has this effect, and because a leaky gut can actually activate the immune system in an unhelpful way in the gut, we see that there is this connection between stress and the gut immune system. Similarly, we see that chronic stress across the body can actually influence the immune system, including within the brain. Sleep deprivation, sometimes I tell people get better sleep, and I get a lot of pushback because people say it's not so straightforward. So, what I would say instead is prioritization of good sleep is really important. The reason is because sleep and the immune system have this delicate dance where our immune system is changed by our sleep, where our sleep is changed by our immune system. By and large, what we see is when people get good sleep, their immune system tends to do better. And this may be one of the key mechanisms by which good sleep helps to keep the brain at a healthy state long term. In addition, we know that poor sleep reduces what is called glymphatic clearage within the brain. So our brain has a system, it's called the glymphatic system. It was actually discovered by researchers at the Oregon Health and Science University, where I did my residency. And the glymphatic system is a clearance system for metabolic waste that builds up during the day. Why that's important is because if we get poor sleep, we have less clearance through the glymphatic system. And if the immune system within the brain is altered, it seems like it actually blocks effective immune or effective clearance through the glymphatic system. Emotional stress, so even watching stressful news, for example, can directly activate the brain's immune system by programming microglial cells towards the state that we don't necessarily want. And then if we were to prioritize getting restorative sleep and prioritize stress resilience, the research would support the fact that these things help to promote brain resilience over our lifespan. There's some really interesting publications that have just come out on these topics in the last couple of years. I'd like to highlight one here that just came out in the journal Alzheimer's and Dementia. So this study, they looked at sleep patterns in brain, or sleep patterns in midlife and brain age. And what they found is that people who had worse sleep, meaning who were saying that they had multiple criteria for worse sleep, sleepiness, they felt sleep quality wasn't very good, they had trouble falling asleep, that 15 years later, that their brain age was significantly higher, meaning that if they had more than a couple of these poor sleep criteria, they had up to 3+ years of an older brain age. So really interesting stuff there. And then as we look at the correlation between stress and brain aging, again, another study, they looked at stress compared to brain aging, and what they found is that emotional stress in particular was correlated with a increased risk for brain aging at 21%. I thought it was interesting that when they looked at like work stress, meaning if a person had a quote stressful job, if they had other things going on in their lives, that wasn't the variable. It was really more how a person experienced the stress that mattered. So, point here being stress seems to age the brain. And as we'll talk about, there are many things we can do to help to mitigate, not remove, but mitigate stress. Can't get through a whole lecture without talking about the value of exercise. You all know that exercise is good for our health. What does it have to do with the immune system? Regular exercise lowers baseline inflammation. It produces anti-inflammatory cytokines. It helps to promote surveillance within the immune system. It also helps to promote kind of perfusion, meaning blood flow to the brain. And exercise is really the only thing that I'm aware of that has been shown to help to regrow brain. I'll say that again. Data from Kirk Erickson and other researchers has shown that exercise may help people to grow back mass in their hippocampus, the part of the brain that is tasked with long-term, I should say, that is focused on creation of long-term memory. So this is really powerful stuff. What do we do about this? Well, aerobic, so think about cardio, but anything that's a repetitive exercise like walking, running, these are things that have been linked to better brain volume, meaning preservation of the hippocampus in particular. Resistance training, too, though, has also been correlated with improved hippocampal volume. Just as a note here, the hippocampus is key to memory, and it's one of the parts of the brain that most atrophies when people tend to experience memory issues. Some of the things you can do, walking, weights, dance, tai chi, all of these have been associated with better brain longevity. So if you're looking at me to give you a specific protocol as to how many times you need to do squats a week or exactly how many miles you need to walk on the treadmill each day, I'm not going to give that to you because the point is any amount of exercise is good. Multiple forms of exercise are good with one caveat. A study just came out in the last couple of years showing that there was a dramatic reduction, over 50% reduction in people's development of dementia when they walked for about 10,000 steps a day. Interestingly, the 10,000 step a day thing was kind of a marketing ploy by a popular wrist wearable that told you to get your steps in, but it turns out to actually be quite accurate when it's been studied in terms of improving brain health. So not everybody's going to be able to do this, but if you're able to get your steps in each day, that is a great plan. Okay, I want to come back to this sleep and lymphatic clearance because I think this is so interesting. So when we sleep, we actually activate this system, this drainage system within the brain. And when we don't get good sleep, you get a buildup of these proteins that we don't want buildup of within our brain, and you get immune dysfunction. When we don't get good sleep, it actually disrupts our immune system and disrupts our cognitive rhythms. And in part, that may be a function of this lymphatic clearance issue. But what are we going for here? 7 to 9 hours of consistent quality sleep. Now, what do you do about this? So there are many different things to consider. Sleep hygiene, which I've done full lectures on this topic by itself, talking about light exposure, noise exposure, air quality, talking about not consuming stressful content before bed, caffeine, alcohol. These are all major components of it. But beyond this, there is some data that specific nutrients, for example, magnesium, may help to support restful sleep. I will say my standard disclaimer here, which is if you're somebody who is struggling with good sleep and you've been trying to do all these things, go see somebody who can get you evaluated with a sleep study. It is an amazing test. It can provide amazing tools. How about when we come back to this psychosocial stress? So chronic loneliness seems to age the brain. That doesn't necessarily solve the issue for people who are lonely, but it is important to know that the flip side, which is social support, appears to be Such a powerful way to buffer some of the negative effects of the stress of loneliness on the immune system. We know, as I mentioned before, that our emotional health directly influences brain immunity. There has been a time that has come and gone where we have looked at our mental health as separate from our overall health, where we'd say, well, this person is healthy, but they have mental health issues. These things are not separate. And I think it is high time we start to understand that working on our mental health is actually working on our physical health. It is not as though those systems exist separately. As I mentioned, the immune system influences mental health, so these things are all intertwined. What do we do about this? Again, there are full lectures that I've done on this topic, but some basic ideas here would be anything that provides you with mindfulness. The modern world is increasingly mindless. If you can tap into anything that brings you back to connecting to your body, to connecting to your environment, that can be doing breath work, that could be going for a walk in nature, that could even just be spending time with your pet. The point here is, especially when we're inundated with screens, turn the screens off, turn inward, and focus on something that allows you to reconnect with a sense of mindfulness. Beyond this, meaning making activities. So, this is not an advocacy for religion or spirituality or anything like that, but it is saying finding ways to connect to something bigger than yourself is really important to this. These are found to be really potent stress buffers. And so these are things that can actually help to directly improve overall state of health and immune health. One last pitch here would be nature exposure. Big fan of nature exposure. I think we are experiencing a relative nature deficit in the modern world. Nature exposure is an anti-stress intervention, and it's also a pro-immune balance intervention. So if you can and if you have access, just getting outside for 10 to 15 minutes a day, spending some time around some green or around some blue, these are things that seem trivial but actually play a major role in our overall health. To kind of round this out here, so this is maybe a little bit more for people out there who are clinicians or who spend more time in the weeds in terms of the medical research, but we're learning a lot about different markers that we can use to give us a sense as to whether the immune system is out of whack. So inflammatory markers, CRP is very popular, but there's also something now called the systemic immune inflammatory or inflammation index that gives us a sense as to inflammatory balance. We also know that nutritional status, so omega-3 index, I think some people have mentioned this in the comments, vitamin D levels, magnesium levels, B12 levels, all of these relate to brain health, relate to the immune system. Some of the metabolic markers that I think we do need to pay attention to are what do we know about our glucose and insulin in particular? So you can get a fasting insulin level, you can get a fasting glucose level. Most people should be getting, at the very least, through kind of standard primary care, would be a hemoglobin A1C. That is also known as an HbA1c. This is a marker of your glucose levels over the last couple of months. And we know that there are correlations between these markers and brain health. Cognitive testing, so there are a number of different tests. There are MoCA tests. There are several additional cognitive tests that can be done in a physician's office. But there's also a lot of stuff that you can do just to get a general sense as to how your cognition is. Some of these are available online. But I would say here again, if you're seeing a health practitioner, you should be able to see what's going on with your cognition if you request that. In addition, I think anything regular tracking can be really helpful. So, regular tracking would basically mean keeping track of the things that you're doing for brain health. So, if you're trying to do things to help to sharpen up your memory or help to just generally feel more grounded, some sort of a journal or a tracking mechanism can be very helpful so you can see the progress. I think this can be very, very valuable, especially when you're coming in to see a practitioner to get a sense as to how things have progressed over time. Okay, so let's round this out finally with a couple of dietary considerations, and then we'll just do some basic takeaways, and then we'll talk about where this research or where this field may be going, and then we'll take a couple of questions. So, brain longevity diet framework. What is it? It's eating plants, healthy fats, diverse polyphenols, adequate protein, and high fiber. You may have some questions about what adequate protein looks like. I have done a lecture on that. You can find it on the Big Bold Health platform if you'd like to learn more. When we look at moderate levels of things that we want to consume, so I think fish, legumes, clean protein, I don't think you have to worry as much about not doing too much. Some people there are certain researchers who are a little bit anti-high protein. And I'm not talking about consuming high levels of protein. I'm just saying in terms of what you might eat in a day, I don't think for most people they need to worry about how much fish or legume consumption they're putting in. Things that we do want to limit are going to be sugar, refined grains, ultra-processed snacks, and excess alcohol. I've also done a lecture on alcohol, talking about what moderate, what high levels look like. You can also find blogs on my website on this topic. There's still a degree of people's debate over alcohol, but it's pretty universally recognized that at high levels, it's quite harmful to the brain. What should you maybe do more of? Fermented foods, herbs and spices, nuts and seeds. These are some of the elements that have been kind of shown to be most valuable in terms of not only being part of these longevity diets, but having a specific connection to the brain. And I should also add here leafy greens. I think those have really been quite well substantiated in terms of their value to brain health. Hydration, mindful eating. Yes, these things matter. I think you can do a whole thing about hydration. I know some people think you need to drink 5 gallons of water a day. I'm not on that bandwagon, but I do think for most people, paying attention to getting adequate hydration, and then just more importantly, paying attention to how you're eating. This is something I personally struggle with, but eating slowly, actually enjoying your food, eating in community. These are things that are found in these blue zones, these longevity areas, and they do seem to be important. Um, to kind of put all this together, core takeaways here would be eat real food, polyphenol and fiber-rich plants, move daily, rest well, support your gut, feed your microbiome, manage stress, connect with others, target immune and metabolic balance through some of these pathways I've just described, and then focusing on small things that compound over time. As much as it is tempting to go the route of the New Year's resolution and say, well, starting January 1st, I'm doing an hour in the gym every day and I'm doing this clean diet where I'm only eating 3 things for the next 4 months. Those are not the things that have been studied to work, and also most people fail. So I'm far more a proponent of finding small ways to incrementally improve your health through healthy habits than I am making massive changes and expecting things to happen overnight. So where do we see the science going next? Targeted lifestyle therapies to prevent and reverse aspects of brain aging. Absolutely. I think this is super interesting. And I think that we are starting to really appreciate the degree and the specifics as to which types of lifestyle may be most beneficial. So we're seeing, for example, research around weightlifting, maybe even more important for brain health than we thought because it increases levels of certain molecules called myokines, like irisin, for example, that may actually boost the brain more than doing a standard aerobic conditioning routine. So we're starting to get some nuance there. We're also starting to get some nuance around deep profiling of the immune system and metabolism. So instead of just saying, well, your blood sugar is good or it isn't, we're saying, well, we need to go one step further. So how is your blood sugar responding in real time to different foods? Is it your blood sugar just being okay over a 3-month period with a hemoglobin A1C, or is it more the variability, the ups and downs we need to pay attention to? And similarly, we're seeing with the immune system, it isn't just what is your white blood cell count. It may have more to do with a subtype of white blood cell that is more interesting as it relates to something like brain health. Partially through the advent of AI, but also just because computing power has gotten much better, what we're seeing is that the testing has improved dramatically, the imaging has improved dramatically, and the data overall has exponentially increased. So Big Bold Health is working with some of the groups that are now doing a comprehensive analysis using blood markers to be able to profile thousands of labs from a single blood spot, which is super cool because usually in order to get that much data, you would have to send somebody into a phlebotomy lab for multiple blood draws. And not everybody wants to do that. So we're starting to get the ability to extract a whole lot more data from a whole lot less invasive therapeutics. So all these things are going to relate to the future of brain aging and what it means to brain longevity. I'm personally so excited by what science is telling us right now. And I hope that all of you have been able to take at least something from this in terms of both understanding why you need to care about this, maybe you already do care about this, but also what we can be doing right now in terms of understanding and implementing some of these strategies that have been linked to brain longevity, especially through the immune system.